boundaries. Our country was established as a nation built upon laws, and we cannot willy-nilly change the laws to accommodate the present condition.
Dr. Scarborough has also appeared on Larry King Live, Fox News, CBS Evening News, The Blaze with Glenn Beck, C-SPAN, National Public Radio, Focus on the Family, and featured in documentaries such as CNN's award-winning special, God's Warriors, and the HBO documentary, Friends of God. Even though these media appearances impact the culture, Pastor Rick still believes that the pastors in the pulpit are God's greatest agent of change.
Charles Finney said, if there is a decay of conscience, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the public press lacks moral discernment, the pulpit is responsible for it. If our politics become so corrupt that the very foundations of our government are ready to fall away, say it with me, the pulpit is responsible for it.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Scarborough.
Well, I tell you, I see a little bit of an evangelist in Erica, who even take up an altar and put her on the road with a tent. Amen? That's a powerful word, I'll tell you. Looks like I'm going again here. Did I do something? I went the wrong way, probably.
Another error. There you go.
Listen, I just learned how to do emails, so you got to be patient with me. I am so delighted to discover you, a Christian Chamber of Commerce. I'm going to try to not bore you. I want to tell you a little bit about who I am. Am I speaking through this mic or this one?
Either one.
Will it not? Okay. I pastored First Baptist Church of Pearland for 12 years back in the 90s. In fact, in 1990, I went to that church, and having been an evangelist for 14 years previous to that, I preached all of my best revival sermons for the first 6 months, and we had revival. The church just began to explode, and people were saved. In the first 18 months we were there, we baptized 500 people into the church. If you know anything about the old sanctuary, God gives the glory for that, absolutely. But if you know about the old sanctuary, if you put down Broadway, it's now Hope Church. But that church is set. I drove by just 2 days ago. My son still lives there. My grandson was playing a football game. I had a little time to burn, so I reminisced. But I drove by that old facility, and I thought, you know, we should have spent all that money and built that big new complex. Just stayed here. And then I drove around and was reminded. Railroad track on one side, subdivision behind it, and beside it, and then 518 in front of it. It was on 3.5 acres of land, had parking spaces for about 200. We were running 1,100. So it was really a necessity. So the church, now get this, a Baptist church voted unanimously to relocate. Now that just don't happen if you know anything about us Baptists, I'm telling you. The reason there's so many other Baptist churches around the First Baptist in any given town is because typically the First Baptist has had people leave and go off and start other churches for one reason or the other. Our missionary spirit is driven by our inability to get along. That's another sermon. But God just blessed the work there. And we were seeing people saved literally every week. When that happens, Satan raises his head. Let me tell you, as you grow, Katie, Chamber of Commerce, this word for you, Erica, and the leadership, Satan's going to try to get in and do anything he can to divide. Human nature is such that we are easily influenced, unfortunately, by all of our wrong passions. And Satan came to town. I got wind on a Sunday morning about a high school assembly that was taking place. That wasn't unusual. I'd done high school assemblies about 14 years of traveling as an evangelist. I was a former football player. I was an offensive center. People tell me I'm still an offensive center. But for you that are old enough, how many of you can remember Mark Mosley kicked field goals for the Redskins? I made him famous. I had every ball he kicked in college. I played for Stephen F. Austin. He went on to the NFL and made millions. He's a legend in Washington. I worked there for just under 2 years teaching Bible study to members of Congress, and still saw him constantly on sports shows. He's a legend. He was the last straightaway kicker in the NFL, set records, just a great athlete and a great person for that matter. But the offensive center, all I got for that was headaches. The reason I say a lot is because I played offensive center. I mean, my forehead was designed to be hit by linebackers who were trying to make sure I fumbled the snap to the punter or to the extra point. But that's a different story. I went on from there and began doing revivals, then pastoring, and now we're in Pearland and there's a high school assembly. Well, several people said, Pastor, you ought to go to this thing. We got a note. The kids that don't want to hear a sexual discussion can go to study hall, but we want to know why they're having that high school assembly. Well, I heard their cry. I sent my associate pastor, Rod Compton. I used to brag, I'm just like Moses. I lean on my rod and my staff because Rod was my staff. So Rod went down and he monitored that assembly. Now, Rod's a throwback to pastors 100 years ago. To this day, we stay in constant contact. He served me for 13 years before he started pastoring in his own right. But Rod couldn't even say pregnant in mixed company. He would call it a mothering way or a family way. And that's not an exaggeration. Never went to movies. He had a very pure heart. He came back to my office after attending the second of 5 assemblies, and he couldn't tell me what he'd heard. He just said, Pastor, you got to hear it. You got to go. You got to go. Well, I learned a long time ago, if you don't schedule your day, somebody else will. Amen? Amen. And I had everything in that day, every half hour scheduled. But because of the way he reported the assembly, I decided, well, I will go. So I handed a guest that we were interviewing for a staff position off to Rod for lunch, and I went to the 5th of 5 assemblies, and guess who was there? My daughter, who was a senior in high school. We had moved in the middle of her junior year. When as a family we prayed about the call that church extended, my 6th grader was she was ready to move. My junior high school student, he was ready to move. But when I came to Misty in the middle of her junior year, she had a word from God we weren't supposed to move. I mean, you understand that. Well, we overruled that, but she struggled to get readjusted, left all of her friends. She didn't like that. But to her credit, she was doing well, and she developed a new circle of friends. When I spotted her in that 5th assembly that I attended, she was halfway between me and the speaker. I said to myself, no matter how bad this is, don't get involved. Just do it privately. And folks, you have been so proud of me. I didn't say one word for 15 minutes. I sat in the back, I took a recorder, I was recording remarks, and there's a reason to tell you this story. The rest of this will be real fast. But it really contextually will tell you, all the boys in the boys' gym, all the girls in the girls' gym, they had black tar paper over the windows. They used a 16mm projection. When the lights came back on, we were so terrified that it took us 2 years of married life to get over that 1 hour of sex education. They basically said, if you do this, you'll get that. I don't know if that thing will sit there. I take medicine for a cough, but it dries me out, so I have to have water close by. I'm not going to baptize or sprinkle anyone, but I have to have it. But I watched, in my mind, that was what sex education was about. You teach kids not to be engaged until they're married. Well, that's not what it was. And now this is in 1992. Fast forward to today, and it'll contextually help you what I'm about to show you. Well, the more she spoke, the angrier I got, as a father and as a pastor. When she pulled out a condom and blew it up like a balloon and made a couple of lewd remarks and told a filthy story, a filthy joke, she then said, she wrote 94% on a whiteboard behind her, and she said, if you use one of these, you'll be 94% protected against the dread disease of then called GRIDS, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency Syndrome. And that's an accurate description of it, by the way. It wasn't politically correct, so it became AIDS. But it was still GRIDS then, and she said, there'll be 94%. Now, let me ask you a question. Who wants to fly on that airplane? You're 94% certain you'll get there. And in the second place, I knew what she said was exactly wrong. So I raised my hand. I was dressed in a suit, had a towel. She said, yes, sir, thinking I was a principal or a leader in the school. I said, ma'am. When I said ma'am, Misty nearly fainted. I could see her. I mean, she almost fell out on the floor. She had no idea her father was present. I said, ma'am, where did you get that statistic? She said, she said, the CDC. And went right back into her planned remarks. Well, I raised my hand again because I knew it was inaccurate. I've been preparing a series of messages on this new disease to protect our people. In God's sovereignty, I was prepared. So when I raised my hand the second time, she ignored me. Now, you know it's hard to ignore in a high school assembly where they talk about anal sex and oral sex and occasionally fornication. You know what's kind of hard to ignore? A Baptist preacher in the back of the auditorium with his hand up. The kids were, I mean, the entire student body. Who is that? That's Misty's dad. That's the pastor of First Baptist Church. He was rifling through the audience. She finally, with a show of consternation, said, "Yes, sir." Boy, it was really hateful the second time. I said, "Ma'am," I said, "I've read everything that's been printed on this subject, I think, in the last few weeks. And I know the CDC doesn't purport that the kind of condoms our teenagers buy at a truck stop are that safe. And certainly not if they're kept in a glove box in the middle of a Houston summer." I said, "They leak and they break." Well, about this time, a teacher stood up. Now, there's 400 students in this particular assembly. She shouts, "I've read the same statistic in a teen magazine." And I literally, at that point, wanted to break down and sob. I didn't. I composed myself. But I thought, how many kids are going to die because of this ungodly assembly? Well, the short story of all this, I had remarks before it was over. By the way, when Misty passed by me leaving the auditorium, you know what she did? She threw her arms around my neck. She kissed me on this cheek and whispered in this ear, "Daddy, I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of you." I'll tell you, that was like saying "sick it" to a cur dog. Now, in 1992, Pearland had 19,000 on the residents, 19,000 on the signboards coming. It was still like a country town. Cattle were grazing right in the middle of town at that time. It was so far removed from the rest of the Metroplex. I found out as I worked through this, it was because of the good old boy system there, where they would allow contractors to come in and pave a street and then change the rules. And so contractors gave up on Pearland. It was too corrupt. And rightly so. So now I've got a problem. Now my philosophy is never go looking for a fight, but don't you ever back away when it shows up. I'm watching my time. I was told in seminary if I had let the crowd out by 12, I'd always be popular. So I assure you, you'll be out here by 12 o'clock. That rule didn't apply in every setting. I went back to my office and I had the forewarning by Rod to record the remarks. So I had them. I called Cactus Cagle. I'm so glad you picked that picture of him. He was still a practicing attorney, dear friend. I called up Cactus and I said, "Cactus, today I secretly recorded a high school assembly. If I make it public, could I be sued?" He said, "Preacher, let me check on that." Now, in the hour between that call and return call, here's the position I took. If he says I can be sued, I'm going to release it as a father and not a pastor. If I can't be sued, it's going to be released as the pastor of First Baptist Church, Pearland. Well, because it has a lot more impact. He called me back. He said, "Preacher, in Texas, public assembly is public information. You can do whatever you wish." And so, boy, that released me. I called in our minister of miscellaneous, our maintenance guy. I called in this gentleman. I said, "I want you to put on a signboard out there on 518. If you want to hear what the kids heard at PHS come Sunday morning, you talk about a church growth strategy." Now, buddy, that worked. The following Sunday morning, the men come to my office about a quarter before the time for church to start and said, "Preacher, the place is packed. We can't get anybody else in." I said, "Well, go ahead, gather all the chairs you can find, ask our people to stand around the walls, and let's make sure our guests are well treated." And that's what happened. I was born a long time ago, but I wasn't born at night. I had sense enough to know that this was a great opportunity for evangelism. Now, everybody there was there because by now it appeared in the Houston Chronicle. A media firestorm had erupted because of the Baptist preacher interrupting a high school assembly. I mean, this thing was becoming something almost out of control. But the room was packed with lost people. So I preached heaven sweet, hell hot, gave an evangelistic invitation, and we had people lined up at the altar giving their heart to Jesus, while everybody else was checking their watch saying, "I thought you was going to talk about the high school assembly." Now it's their time. Church is over. I sit them down and I said, "Folks, here's the transcript. I've got enough for everybody here. If you want to hear what happened at PHS, then you stick around. You are dismissed." So a few people with schedules left, but the main body remained. I passed out that transcript, and I read it to our church line by line, just like Amy, the speaker, had said, the 4-letter words and all. I mean, there's some little old ladies in Pearland that still can't believe they heard the pastor say those words. And I didn't delight in doing it, but here was my position. If the kids can hear it, you parents need to hear it. You've got to know what's going on in Pearland High School. And boy, by the time I got through reading those remarks, our people ready to charge down and I mean burn the building down. One of our men stood up and shouted, "What are we going to do about this?" I said, "We're going to calm down. We're going to pray. I've requested a special called board meeting. It'll be tomorrow night, a week from tomorrow night, and I'm going to share with our board what I think should be done to remedy this." Well, unbeknown to me, there was a Chronicle reporter in the audience that morning, and now there's a whole page in the metropolitan section. The lead story of the second section of the paper was all about me taking on the Pearland High School School Board. My wife and I literally had to leave town because of the press. We hid out for 5 days. I was given 5 minutes to speak. It's a lot easier to speak for a half hour than it is 5 minutes. Trust me. You've all had to do that. I began to refine my remarks. I began to slash things, redo it. For a week, I worked on my 5 minutes, and I had it down packed. When I got to the school board meeting, I couldn't find a place to park. And when I walked in, I found they'd already moved it twice, and they were now in the largest hall available. Over 400 people there, about 300 from our church. They had me scheduled to speak as the first speaker, and 6 people followed me, including a pastor who had status in the community, who was going to all rebut what they thought I would say. They had pictured me as a raving, lunatic, Baptist fundamaniac who was going to rant and rave, and they were going to pick me apart because I didn't believe in sex education. Well, the Lord had given me one word from the scripture for that audience. A soft word turneth away wrath. Now, folks, my normal speech is pretty loud. And when I'm emotionally confronted, I can get pretty aggressive. But I walked in that place determined not to raise my voice, but to speak softly. And I began to read my remarks to make sure everything was documented. And I didn't plan for something. 11 standing ovations. People stood up and just cheered what I said. And I learned something that day and never forgot. I learned politicians can count. When they began to look at the response of the community, they began to listen more carefully. You know what I found out? I found out they loved their children. They weren't doing this job that required so much and paid nothing, just so they could have power. Not in Pearland at that time. I think things have changed since then. But they said they were parents that they were engaged, we weren't. And they had no idea the assembly was that far over the top. They had assumed that it was in the boundaries. When I read pieces of it, they stopped and began asking me questions. Now I have about 15 minutes. And then when I finished, the next 6 speakers, 2 students, 2 teachers, and 1 minister, another out of the community, they made fools of themselves. I mean, they literally did. I wish I could tell you the whole story of how Pastor that did that and I reconciled and how he publicly repented and the revival that came from that. I mean, folks, when you do the right things happen. When you do nothing, bad things happen. But that was my day when God says, Scarborough, I have a different mission from you than what you thought. Pastor this church, but get your people involved in the political realm. Do you understand that in Romans 13 it calls those involved in government ministers? And it's a ministry as rich and real as the call to preach. The tragedy of today is we're like the center verse in Isaiah 3, which documents 9 things that happen to a nation in decline. And in the center, there are 2 points. It says, when the homosexuals come out of their closets and declare their sin as Sodom and hide it not, woe to their soul. And right after that it says, men will come to you and say, you let this whole thing be under your hand. You be our ruler. And the response of the good people is, don't make me a ruler of the people. I'm too busy. Apathy. Teacher was trying to teach kids about what the meaning of apathy was. You probably have heard this. And so she says, tell me what you believe apathy is. And one of the kids said, I don't know. And another one said, I don't care. And there's your definition. I don't know and I don't care. And ask these that are running for Congress, like Tim and others, the biggest heartburn they have is getting Christians to vote.
We have the largest voting bloc in this country, but we don't show up. Well, we showed up in Pearland. We took over the school board. We took over the city council. People of ours started running for the state legislature. 3 served. That's when Christiane Amanpour started following me around with a microphone and videotaping everything I said and everywhere I went, along with Nancy Pelosi's daughter, Andrea Pelosi, who worked for HBO. They started following me around. They did their documentaries, Satan Meant It for Evil. All that did was expand the awareness in this country. Somebody's doing something. Discerning Christians saw through the hate that they were spewing, and people began to call. I began writing and I began speaking out. In 2002, after 12 years at that church, I resigned and took the show on the road at the urging of men like D. James Kennedy and Jerry Falwell and others who lined up to endorse our work and became our overseeing board. 3 of our men went on starting the state legislature. When Christiane Amanpour concluded her documentary, you can watch it on YouTube, she said, Dr. Scarborough's gains will be short-lived. She actually said short-lived in English. Well, you be the judge. 3 of them went to the state legislature. 1 died in office. A high school is named after him. Dawson Junior High. High school, I mean. Another one is still seated there, serving at his 5th or 6th or 7th term. I lost count. And the 3rd one was Randy Weber, who wasn't even in our church when this began, started coming. I baptized him, as a matter of fact. We became close friends. And for 18 months, I taught Bible studies. He's now a sitting congressman in Washington. And I did Bible studies in his office as a result of taking a stand. A stand. Folks, once you get in that war, you better be prepared for it. And there were times when I laid in bed at night and wept because there was such pressure everywhere we went. And we're now getting right back into that. I thought when I went to Washington in 2017 and handed the reins of Vision America to a subordinate, I'd just come around and speak, and I wouldn't have to worry about all that anymore, and I could just teach Bible study and do what a pastor's called to do. Had Bible studies with congressmen, with the State Department, with a host of about 20 folks who came every month to that study. I discipled men in the Pentagon and had discipleship with the president of the World Bank about twice a month. It was a glorious time. That's when 2018 came. I was in Washington. I wasn't out speaking anymore, and nobody else was either. And what happened? Beto O'Rourke, who holds none of our values, almost took out Ted Cruz, whose father's a minister, who can quote the entire Constitution. He's known how to do that since he was junior high school because his father required him to, because his father so loved America after being in prisons in Castro's Cuba. And he almost lost a seat. Why? Because so few Christians showed up. So I resigned my post at the urging of my former board. I came back and reconstituted under Recover America, and I am now engaged, and we're going to take a trip around Texas and shake her to the foundation. Now, let me tell you something. I don't mean to sound arrogant, but you see, in 2001, when all this was happening in Pearland, and I'm still pastor, I got a phone call from a very wealthy doctor. Now, you got to listen in 2 minutes to the rest of this. I got slides to show. This wealthy doctor said, could you do in Texas what you did in Pearland? I said, if I had the money, I could. He said, well, how much would it cost? I went to see my friend since high school, Steve Holtze, who's very involved in politics and loves Jesus. We worked out a $1.2 million budget. I went back. He offered to pay $800,000 of it. I resigned First Baptist Church Pearland, and we took a trip around the state of Texas, did about 40 different meetings, and we had 2,000 pastors who signed up to be Texas Patriot pastors who would mobilize their people and vote their values. And in 2002, go back and check the record, that's when Texas turned from blue to red for the first time since Reconstruction. And the impact in Harris County, where we did a lot of the work, was that every single office throughout the entire county was held by people who were pro-life and pro-family. Now, we've been slipping back year after year after year after year. So when I came back from Washington, D.C., at the urging of my former board, now reconstituted, we decided we were going to do the same thing in 2020. COVID hit. So I zoomed myself to death. We put our plans off to 2022. In prelude to 2022, one of my staff members walked in and said, Rick, did you know that there is a school board election
in November of this year in Harris County, in HISD. And I'm going to show you about 3 slides only because this is typical of all of our schools if you check. There were 5 school boards set up in that election, which meant if we could move the church, we could capture a majority of the school board positions in one election cycle. In the last election cycle, 2 years ago, or 4 years ago, no, 2 years ago, there were 4 seats out. Did you know one of them was won with 2,500 votes? Now think about that. These are the people setting the education curriculum and direction of your schools in the largest school system in Texas and the 7th largest in America. And when we began to look into it, here's what we discovered. They were teaching. They say they didn't teach critical race theory. This is off their website. Critical race theory, socio-historical theory, queer theory, feminist theory, etc., etc., etc. Here's the next slide we pull off. They teach them how to become transgender, what drugs they need to take, and what surgery is required. That's from the website. We also found this. They were offering a new program where they paid students, by the way, LGBTQ community alphabet, whatever it is. They paid the children $125 to take the course so they can discover if they're really gay or not. It's a program developed by Northwestern University so you can figure out if you really are gay or not and how to relate to gays. Pay the students who want to take it. And then finally, one more that you need to see. This was from Sci-Fair, which we're also engaged in now. The ADL is sponsoring in schools all over America, and you can Google this, No Place for Hate. Does anybody want our schools to be a place of hate? Anybody? But here's what they teach. Bisexual, cisgender, cross-dresser, gay, gender expression, gender identity. The list is endless. And here's the only hate that they will not tolerate is a Christian who says, I won't teach that, or a Christian who says, I won't embrace that. Try that and see how much hate comes your way. Right now, you can Google it for yourself. Just this week, we finally been discovering we've been hiding. We've been in the short or tall grass. We didn't want anybody to know what we were doing, but it broke when we started having candidate forums. And now there's an article that you can go from a group. I'd never heard of them before, but boy, are they well funded. But they're calling me the term they use is that I'm a white supremacist. Now, the rest of the article came right off our website from speaking engagements. They're now tracking me and listening. Somebody may be here today. And they've accurately reported exactly what I believe. It was a great PR piece except for the heading. But you see, that's the attack. And we know it's just starting. You know, I really didn't want to get back into this, but somebody has to. You have to stand. Now, here's what I want you to know. Finally, it's time to mobilize. Here's our prayer. You prayed this. If we win these 3 school boards we're weighing in on, then we're going to go around Texas and do 50 events. We've got a $2 million budget for this, and we've got to raise it. But we're going to be in about, we've already targeted about 55 locations. We have a map. You can come to our office and see it where we intend to go. The larger cities will do anywhere from 2 to 4 events because of the size of the magnitude of the population. In smaller settings, county seat towns, 1 event. But we're going to send people in ahead of us if we're fully funded to make sure the pastors are there. That's the hard part. When pastors are confronted with the truth, if they've been called, they're going to respond. And our goal is to get 2,000 pastors who will be patriot pastors in Texas once again, who will take over their local school boards, not taken over, but Christians in offices, teach their people that they should run for those local offices. And if they get excited about that, we'll sweep right through every election coming up. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm a Christocrat. I'm a follower of Jesus. But with God's help, we're going to try to shake Texas up and move her back to bright red as people vote pro-life, pro-family, and get this crap out of our schools. God bless you. I'll take some questions. I got several books that are available, and I want you to give away a couple of them.
First of all, does anybody have, wow, thank you. Praise God. Anybody hear the message? It's time to stand? Yes, okay. By show of hands, how many